Mr. Minister, thank you very much for being with us here this evening and for agreeing to release the book, almost in some ways in the second time, because of the iteration and the history of this volume. I promised the minister that when we had this conversation, I would not vex him with more questions about India, Russia, Ukraine, and oil purchases. I intend to keep that promise. I want to focus the conversation this evening on the role of ideas in the making of India's rise as an emerging great power. And so let me ask you for a personal reflection, to start the conversation with a personal reflection. You've had a professional career that has taken you all the way from the erstwhile Soviet Union to Eastern Europe, to Sri Lanka, to Singapore, and to the United States. And you've done it with Japan and China thrown in. And you've done this at a time when the world itself has been in dramatic transformation and flux. So when you think back about this long and storied career, what would you reflect upon as being the principles that India employed or the objectives that India sought to achieve in its dealings with all these countries?
Okay. Actually, before I answer your question, first of all, let me congratulate you and Bibek and Raj on the book. I got the book 48 hours ago. I attempted some speed reading. And, you know, I really want to say something as a generic proposition regarding this book. Very often, when it comes to foreign policy, diplomacy, people tend to be very prescriptive in a very narrow sense. Okay. The interesting thing about this book, which I liked, was you kind of organized it with a vision, which is your chapter, with a set of articles which deal actually with the foundation, the base on which Indian foreign policy can or cannot deliver or partially deliver. So it's a kind of infrastructure to the superstructure of the diplomacy. Then looked at capacities. And I mention that because it's not often that any analysis of foreign policy tends to look at capacities. Then looked at the footprint. Yep. So, you know, what is it you've done? What is it you want to do? And finally, there's Raj's piece about the, in a sense, the terms of engagement. Yep. So my very, very sort of quick feedback, I mean, as your marketing agent to all of them, you know, it's actually a different book, because I'll tell you one thing very frustrating as a policymaker. You know, to get advice from people who are completely divorced from the realities of capacities with the realities of your situation. You know, who'll advocate, go do this, do that, confront this person, this country, take that posture. It can be quite annoying, you know. So to get something which is actually grounded, and in that sense, I mean, to my mind, the big thought I had, and I know I'm straying from your question, is it's particularly important in a sense to have a much more multidisciplinary approach to the prospects of countries and to the prospects, to the diplomatic and foreign policy prospects of countries. Because if you don't have it, I think a lot of that, you know, aspiration is frankly empty talk. Now, having got that out of the way, you know, your question, what over the years, what in a sense are the enduring principles? I would sort of put it to you on a kind of XYZ axis. I think one part of what is enduring is a kind of ambition for India, that the x-axis, you have to relentlessly look at the international situation and say, okay, where is the space for me to keep growing? Okay. The y-axis, in a way, is the capacities. Because people don't realize how often capacities constrain choices. If you look at economic capacities, military capacities, even nuclear capacities, the exercise of our nuclear options were often capacity determined. And it's not like, the Chinese tested in 64, so why didn't you test immediately afterwards? Or the NPT got done, so why didn't you test? I mean, there was a very good reason why the first test was 74. Yeah. It was a capacity influenced decision. It wasn't entirely a policy influenced decision. And in all of this, of course, there's the y-axis, which is between ambition and capacity. How do you keep growing your space? That independence, so I would say, maximizing your space, sharp elbows as you go up. How do you do that? Now, that's the kind of a big picture way. But then there's the statecraft side to it. And the statecraft side to it, the enduring side, is constantly how do you manage to harmonize or reconcile or somehow, in some way optimize the short term and the long term. The short term often puts pressures on you. You do not want your short term pressures to endanger your long term goals. You do not want your long term ambitions to actually get you into short term problems. So that's the diplomatic bit. But the constant bit is really, if a country like India, if it's drilled into you, which it was into me, that look, you're born in a country, this country has prospects, we're going to go up, this is what your life is about, you have to keep taking it up, and that has to keep you going. And in many ways, frankly, that has been the enduring principle.
And would it be fair to say that today, 30, 40 years after you first joined the Foreign Service and started doing this business, 45 years after you joined the Foreign Service, would it be fair to say that today India's margins for maneuver have increased considerably, and that the pressures that you identified, either structural constraints on India's ambitions or the capacity constraints, where would you judge India on that path? How much maneuver does India have today? What are the prospects for increased maneuver, say, over the next 10 to 15 years?
Oh, absolutely. I think the maneuvering space has increased because capacity has increased. The footprint has grown. The ability to influence the environment and other players has grown. But it's also balanced to some degree with more interests. And every interest has not a vulnerability, but a certain anxiety or a sort of a desire to defend that interest or advance that interest. The other change is also that the more you grow, there's the Newton's third law of politics. Your competitors will react with greater shall I say, sense of purpose. So you will draw upon yourself much more attention and possibly more than attention in that. So at one level, I mean, I would say it's more less worrisome existence if you are less of a player at one level. I mean, you have different worries. You have the worries of a lesser player.
Sure.
But as you go up the ladder, it's not like your worries come down. Different kinds of, not worries, but I would say calculations and, sort of thought processes. And as I said, I mean, this is an infinite, endless game of rising. So how do you keep going up? I mean, every day you ask yourself, where am I, what's going to come tomorrow, what's going to come next week, what's going to come next month, how do I prepare, have I done better? That's really what it is about.
So when you look at the prospective future, you have a history of success now coming to this moment. You have attracted the attention of those who wish you well, and you've attracted the attention of those who do not wish you well.
Yes.
So what do you think are the pieces in play that you would want to see developed further in order to allow you to maximize that leverage? So over the next 10 years, what are the most important things that India has to do and get right if it is to achieve these ambitions of greater space, greater presence, and greater influence on rulemaking?
At one level, you could say, I'll give a short version of your question if I understood it right, which is really, what is it you're going to do to make the rise faster?
Yes.
So my answer would be, at one level, really to keep finding the right combination of partners to advance your interests. And I would emphasize that at one, you could say, well, I've heard various words used. I've used myself some words. It's not that simple, because it would depend on the domain. As I said at my conversation at the beginning of this conference, your economic partners, your political partners, your security partners, your technology partners, your energy partners are not the same. So the weightage will differ. Sometimes the combination would differ. But if you make a kind of a aggregate of all of this, you will get a clear set of outlines. Not every country would declare this openly, but there are very few countries which don't have a sense of who their fundamental partners are and who their fundamental challengers are. Okay. So the way to rise, I would say, is to maximize that the opportunities, and the opportunities are provided by the contradictions of the world. Every rising power looks for contradictions, because if there were no contradictions, there's no space for the rising power to move. So it's not like, what would you wish for? I take the world as I get it. Yes, today perhaps a little more than I was before. I could shape some of it. But I'd be honest, I don't think I can fundamentally shape the world. I think there's still many other powers much more powerful than me who have that capacity. But I would look at the global contradictions and assess from that the possibility of utilizing that to my national advantage. Now, having said that, there are times when you would hedge, or I would hedge.
Yes.
There are times when I don't think hedging by itself should be a reflex policy. It would depend on the situation. It would depend on the issue. It would depend on the moment. So there are issues, I think, where we need to be much more, in a sense, simplistically in the middle. There will be issues where it would be foolish for me to be in the middle, because my interests are clearly involved, and I need to actually shape the narrative, set the narrative. And part of what you said, to try to aspire or seek to become a leading power, is that ability of picking and choosing, where to shape, where to actually get ahead, where to be a little bit prudent, where to be in the middle. So it's really a very nimble footwork,
yes,
if you would say. And it's a very 360 kind of vision of the world and its prospects. And I think that's really what is required for this country, and for some time. I still think we have good ways to go.
So let me ask you a question. And I take the point completely that having a stable sort of congeries of partners will be critical for India moving forward. How would you deal with these partners who wish you well at two levels? What do you tell them is the value proposition for them in terms of supporting India? Mm-hmm. And two, what capabilities would you imagine India bringing to the table that would make India an attractive investment destination, not in an economic sense, but in a political sense, for the partners that you envisage?
You know, in a way, actually, that's exactly what I do. I mean, if I were to go to any country or meet any other foreign minister or anybody else, most of my meetings are sliced up that way. I mean, the first part of it is, what use am I to you? And frankly, the second part of it is, what use are you to me? There is, I mean, this sounds horribly transactional. I don't want it to come out that way, because I think when we say use, it also means if you have beliefs. I mean, to me, utility is not a non-belief activity. There are beliefs, there are values, there are commonalities out there. They do matter very much, in my opinion. They certainly create comfort levels which somebody with a very different sociology may not give you. But a large part of the conversations of a foreign minister, certainly a foreign minister of a country which seeks to be a leading power, is really to put before your potential or actual partners what is the value proposition that India brings. And secondly, what is it that, why is it important for them, as you said, to invest in India? Now, let me kind of illustrate that with some examples, because this is now beginning to sound very, very philosophical. So, I would say today, an India which is willing, in a sense, very an exemplar in green and clean technologies, or an India which is today sort of a successful, not an experiment, but a successful deliverer on digital goods. And which shares that view that, the digital era requires trust and transparency. Or an India which is part of a reliable supply chain. Or an India that on a certain set of strategic, which say works with other partners on maritime security. These would be examples. But I would also, one part of it would be, look, you and I can work together and we can do these things together. But the other part of my persuasion or projection would be, an India which is economically strong is a strategic asset to a large part of the world. And India, for example, which is a first responder, bears a big part of the global burden. And India, which is today an innovator and a contributor, let us say, in space or cyber or nuclear, is part of a global effort to develop those domains in a certain comfortable way. So a lot of it is, it's not in that sense, yes, it's a competitive world, but the heart of my business is, in a competitive world, how do you create the commonalities? How do you take along other countries, so that they also reasonably calculate that their benefits and the global collective benefits are there. That's really what my business is about.
Let me ask you a sort of philosophical question, and it comes from the Prime Minister's, formulation of what he sees as a desirable world order. So it has always struck me that despite all the competitive elements in international politics that you referred to, the Prime Minister has still emphasized the idea of a common humanity, a common vision, and so on and so forth. In practical terms, what challenges does that impose? Because you have a vision which is very unifying, which sort of focuses on reconciliation among many competing entities on a very large and macro scale. And yet in your business, you have to deal with, the rough and tumble of the competition. So how do you work that out? The vision that looks for commonalities and the realities that are competitive, where, it's a dog-eat-dog world sometimes. And in your own neighborhood, the environment is not always conducive to realizing that vision that the Prime Minister has. So how do you balance this desire for cooperation amidst the enduring realities that there are some people who simply don't want to cooperate with you because their interests or their ambitions are different?
Well, there is much merit to casting bread on waters. So when you actually, this larger vision, I would argue that the larger vision actually yields concrete benefits. There is a larger vision, Today, we have this program called Vaccine Maitri, which is like vaccine friendship, by which we supplied vaccines to a very large part of the world, okay? And many of the recipients of these vaccines were countries who had vaccine production centers much closer than India. So if you go to many countries in the CARICOM, in the Caribbean, or you go to people in the Pacific, or you go to countries in Africa, many of them, their first vaccines came from India. Whereas, as I said, theoretically, they could have got it from alternative sources. I cannot overstate to you the goodwill and the impact that it has made on countries. And by the way, it was not an easy decision, because this was a time when we were vaccinating our own people. So somebody could reasonably have asked, saying, why are you sending vaccines out? But I think it was part of the Prime Minister's belief that while, yes, our primary duty is obviously to our own people, at the same time, we should also make that additional effort and reach out. But the idea of doing good is not impractical. There's actually a deep practicality underpinning that. It's part of a certain brand building, of a certain image. Again, if you look at the last 8 years, the development programs that we have done across the world has really ramped up multiple X's. But it's not just the fact that we're doing programs outside. We've been very, very clear. Prime Minister personally has been very clear. He went to Kampala and laid out what he called the principles of development cooperation, and basically told Africa that, look, we are prepared to work on your priorities, your programs, your projects. If you tell us what is of interest, we'll try and do what you want. Now, for the Africans to have someone come and say, look, you tell me what you want, and I'm prepared to tell you yes or no, I can or cannot do it, I think was very different from what they were used to. Similarly, if you look, you mentioned the neighborhood. Today we have actually, I wouldn't say transformed the connectivity in the neighborhood, but it's clearly changed enormously. But that connectivity goes both ways. I mean, we built a power grid to Nepal at a time when Nepal was power deficient. And, Kathmandu has gone through some decent years because of that. But today the same power grid helps us to get power back from Nepal. So we do not actually really have this. There are countries who have this nationalistic view of my nationalism versus the world. That is not the way we are messaging. For us, the idea of having global agenda, global good, global acceptability completely harmonizes with the fact that I'm also advancing my national prospects along with it. And I think that does set us apart. So in a sense, even though I know it's a absolute oxymoron, we have a kind of internationalist nationalism.
I want to ask you the uncomfortable dimension of that internationalist nationalism. India is a sovereign state.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, it may be compelled to use force to defend its interests. There is a vast area of cooperation,
mm-hmm.
which you've elaborated. But as a state in a competitive state system, you cannot renounce the use of force. You cannot, right?
And we haven't.
So can you talk about how you imagine, what India imagines the legitimate uses of force to be? And as India grows in power, what would be the parameters with respect to the use of force?
You know, it's a subject, it's actually a scenario with which we have been very cautious. We have been very cautious because if you look at the history of the last 75 years, mostly this country has used force defensively when it is threatened, almost always within its own borders. Okay? There's no problem with that. You know, tomorrow if the country is threatened, we will use force. There's no ambiguity there. The issue, in a sense, you're raising is application of force outside your national jurisdiction. We've had relatively limited experience of that, one of which was in Sri Lanka in 1987. I myself was with the peacekeeping force for 2 years. I can tell you it was a very, very difficult, very troubling, and a very, at the end of the day, a very counterproductive exercise. And that did scar, you know, policymakers for a generation.
Yes.
Okay. Don't get sucked into endless, open-ended commitments. It's not unique to us. Other countries have had their versions of it. Overall, I would say countries tend to be cautious. There are some, like the United States, which, to my mind, are truly an exception. You know, I don't think the U.S. can really serve as an example for anybody else. It is a sui generis case. But most countries today would be very, very cautious about the use of force outside. They would like to keep it targeted. They would like to keep it, in a sense, very purposeful. And they would avoid getting sucked into something which they cannot see. Now, having said that, if you ask me, so where do I see this going? I honestly cannot answer that question because if you were to ask me when I entered the Foreign Service, where would you see India in the next 45 years? I wouldn't have imagined I would be where I am. I wouldn't have imagined the world today which I see around me. So, and since the pace of change is quickening, but I would say this, that for a country like India, our interests are growing. The fact is the global environment today makes it more and more necessary for countries individually or in combination to secure their well-being abroad. So it's not like somebody else is going to do it for you. I think that expectation is less with each passing day. So if you take more capability, less global assurance, continuing, if not greater, competition, I think there will be situations which this country will have to face. But I can't really explicate on that. But it's certainly something which will be in our thoughts.
So let me end this conversation where we began, where we were talking about partnerships. And I asked this question primarily from the perspective of my own country, because that has been a truly transformative and novel development between the United States and India in the last 20 years. When you talk about partnerships, very often our experience is to use the words, but imagine that means something like an alliance. What would you educate us with respect to the distinctions between the two? When you think of partnerships, what do you mean? Because you know the history of American alliances, you know the history of American expectations about alliances. How far can we go in this bilateral relationship without it becoming the alliance which I suspect India wants to avoid, no matter how close it comes to the United States?
You know, not confusion, but the synonymity between partnerships and alliance is particularly and peculiarly American. And there's a very good reason for it. But the reason for it is American history. So when you look around the world, because you have alliances, you have bilateral treaties, so you have, you know, for you, when you say partnership, partnerships for you mean treaties and means alliance. Okay. That is something which simply doesn't harmonize with where India is coming from. We are a post-colonial society, very fiercely protective of our independence, wishing to maximize our choices, as I said, expand our spaces. So a lot of the talking past each other, which we've had for some years, is because there is this habitual superpower and this idiosyncratic rising power. And they are saying sometimes the same things, but in their own minds, they mean different things. Now, what has changed? Because I have a concrete proof that there is change. That change, to my mind, is the Quad. That it's interesting, policymakers in America, people in administration, have understood this. You know, I get more grief from analysts. I'm not pointing a finger, but you know, from people in think tanks and sort of the public space about what their expectations and their definitions are of what a partnership is. You know, so it's like, how can India be a good Quad member if the Indian position on Ukraine is not identical with that of the United States? That was never the basis of Quad. So policymakers, you know, I don't have a problem, talking to and interacting and explaining and dealing with the administration. It's much more, it's the public space. You know, this happened to us in a way when the nuclear deal got done. The government was the revolutionary force. The public space actually lagged behind. And, you know, and was sort of constantly questioning the pace and direction of the change. To some extent, I would argue that's happening in the US today. That the administration has actually been very pragmatic, very understanding, very much forward-looking about how to work with a country like India. And the Quad is very interesting because the other three are treaty allies.
Right.
Okay. Right. For three treaty allies to work with a non-treaty, non-alliance country is a novel experience for us as it is for them. So we are all having to change as we go along. I mean, we too have to, sometimes, shall I say, revisit some of our assumptions and try to figure out how this works. And the fact that the Quad has grown so much in the last 5 years, I think is a testimony, if I say so myself, to the creativity and to the far-sightedness of people in the governments of these 4 countries over the last 5 years. So, look, bottom line is this. I come back to my first answer.
Yes.
You know, when I said to me, Indian foreign policy is about a relentless, unending quest to go up in the international order. And for me, sky is not the limit for that. And to do that, because I told you I have to harmonize my short term and my long term, I have to be very careful that the stresses and the challenges of the day do not fundamentally jeopardize my direction, my persona, my strategy, my sense of myself.
Yeah.
So I'm very much more confident in 2022 that this kind of working arrangement with a country like the US, because Japan and Australia, in a sense, are much more narrow in how they are plugged into. It is America which has a global vision of
Yes.
Alliances,
Yes.
and to some extent, I would say the critical inflection point where the events leading up to and the nuclear deal itself. But look at what has happened after 2005.
Yeah.
So if you were to ask me, saying, okay, in these years, what has been the really remarkable change in how India views the world in terms of relationships? I think there's no question it's our relationship with the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a wonderful place on which to end this conversation, because there is reason for optimism at both ends. I mean, the United States, and I see Lisa here, who played a critical role in putting
I was looking
together.
at her when I was saying some of the nice things.
Yeah, and well deserved, well deserved. The example of the Quad is really that great manifestation where the US is now learning to deal with institutional arrangements that are not natural to itself. And the fact that India is now very comfortable with that close relationship with the United States, despite the absence of an alliance, I think augurs very well for the future. So let me thank you, Minister, once again for spending time with us this evening. And I believe the next item on our agenda is that you actually formally release the book. So we will go through, the ritual of bringing up the books to you. And I would like to invite my co-editors to come to the podium as well. And then we can proceed with the actual ceremony. But thank you so very much.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Fine Print on WION with me, Neha Khanna.